part of this. He writes, this conflict is therefore about our common transatlantic values of liberty and democracy. It is about the right of small nations to live freely and determine their own future. It is about the great power struggles for influence of the 20th century versus the path of integration and unity defined by the European Union of the 21st. Georgia has made its choice. What have you worked with Georgia, first of all, and what do you think about what's going on there now?
Yes, we have worked in Georgia for close to 15 years now, working with political parties, working with the parliament, working with civic organizations in trying to help sort of stabilize the situation, support Georgian Democrats as they build new political and economic structures in the country. This is about sharing experiences and expertise by the international community as they struggle to consolidate their democratic institutions in the country. And the conflict that is taking place right now has gone well beyond South Ossetia. It goes to the heart of Georgian sovereignty and to the heart of the institutions that it is struggling to create.
Lorne Kramer, your group, this is from your annual report writing about Russia. Your group wrote that democratic institutions and processes continue to face challenges in the Russian Federation. Is this invasion of Georgia part of that challenge?
Well, I do think that the Putin government has looked at the Georgians. As Ken said, it's gone well beyond the issue of South Ossetia when you're bombing in the rest of the country. And I do think they've looked at Georgia. They look at Georgia as a bit of a problem because it's a democratic state on their periphery. And they would like to, teach Georgia a lesson, as they might put it. And I think part of the issue here is that it is a democracy, and they don't like democracies on their periphery.
Also, I should add that it is a country that overwhelmingly, over 70%, want to join Western institutions. They seek to join the European Union. They seek to join NATO. This was a referendum that was passed earlier this year. So this is a broad support that crosses all ideological lines in Georgia, seeking to enter into Europe.
Let's hear from our C-SPAN viewers and listeners. Tampa, Florida first on our Independence line. Good morning.
Well, first off, go Team USA. Yeah, that's a good thing. I'm wondering why it is, if we're going to promote democracy everywhere, would either of you gentlemen right now trade the quote-unquote democracy that was going on in Iraq prior to our invasion of that country, or the quote-unquote democracy going on in Iran, for if you could bring back the Shah in Iran, or if you could bring back Hussein in Iraq, and those countries would be stable and friends of ours again, what would your choices be, and why? Thank you.
Well, I think just let me take the example of Iran, first of all. I think this is why many, many people got engaged in this business, why both President Carter and President Reagan thought there was wisdom to it. In Iran, we made the mistake for many, many years of backing a man, a single man, and not the population of the country as they tried to gain greater and greater liberties. And we paid the price for that. As Colin Powell has said, for 2 generations, we earned the enmity because of that, of the Iranian people. I think what we try and do is work within a system. We're not about regime change, though the focus on democracy has come at the same time as Iraq and Afghanistan. But what we try and do is work within the country with those who are trying to make the country better. I do not think Saddam Hussein was a friend of ours for many, many years before we invaded Iraq.
What does your report say about regime change, about military action to impose a democracy or to propel a democracy forward?
Well, unfortunately, in the eyes of some critics, democracy promotion has come to mean military invasion because of the controversy over the Iraq War. We say in the report that military intervention should be left to the most extreme circumstances, and this is not a way that is normally used to advance democracy. And also, I think we make the case that there is very little to the promotion side of this. What mostly we're doing is responding to a demand that citizens around the world have to play a role in their lives, the political lives of their country. So we're responding to sort of universal aspirations that exist around the world. So this is not something being exported from abroad. It is something that it is homegrown.
Nico, Florida is next, a Democratic caller.
Yes, good morning. Bill
Good morning.
Allen from Micco here. Yeah, I was just wondering with the Harris Corporation, which is right up the road here on Highway 1, I was wondering what they had to do with the newspapers and the radio stations and the TV stations that are over there in Iraq, as well as I was just wondering how many countries send representatives like you all over here to help us with our democracy, which has been absolutely decimated. And one more comment. I think what Bush and Putin were talking about the other day in China was Bush was asking Putin if Alabama or Louisiana was next on his list of invasions. That was probably it. Bye.
Thank you, Florida.
Well, I'm not familiar with the Harris Corporation. I can tell you that the United States welcomes other countries coming to observe our democracy. When I was at the State Department, we brought in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which observes elections throughout Eurasia, and invited them to come here to observe our elections, to compare them with other countries' elections. I think the bigger point as far as other countries go is how many countries are now doing this work. In the 1990s when we did this, we basically worked with the British who did this work and the Germans who did. Now there are dozens of countries, including brand new democracies, that are joining with us in this work. So it's no longer an American export. You know, we are able to bring examples from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America. We brought East Timorese to El Salvador to see how their democracy is working. We brought Belarusians to Lithuania to see how their democracy is working. It's very much a multilateral enterprise at this point.
And your report, lots of pictures, including this one here, one of several of elections observers, this one in Sierra Leone. Let's go to Emporia, Kansas, on our Republican line. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Wollack. Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I read briefly through the report and liked some elements of it, particularly the notions about the need for stability and security. But I'm having a hard time getting past the rhetoric and looking at the realities. For instance, in Georgia, we host a young student from Moldova. She's well aware that they're in a similar situation to Georgia. There's a breakaway region in Moldova where the Russians exert great influence. And to her, the message is very clear that the Russians are sending is that don't be democratic. Now, the question I have is that in the current situation, I doubt that we're going to act. I really doubt that Europe is going to act, and I doubt that the United Nations is going to act. How do we promote democracy when we have rhetoric on one hand and a lack of action on the other?
Well, I would say for the people of Georgia, this is not rhetoric for them. They have been struggling to create democratic institutions over the past decade and a half. They happen to believe, I think civil society, political parties, the parliament, and government believes that this is the best way to bolster stability in their country. One has to only look at the situation in Pakistan over the last 10 years. We thought that Musharraf would provide stability in Pakistan to deal with the threats from terrorism, the threats coming from radical forces, extremist forces in Pakistan. And what we found was that we pursued stability at the expense of democracy, and we achieved neither. And ultimately, it was only democratic processes that were able to help Pakistan get through the crisis last year.
The New York Times yesterday ran an analysis of the Georgia conflict. Helene Cooper, part of which reads, the Bush administration's strong support for Georgia, including the training of Georgia's military and armed support, came in part as a reward for its support of the United States in Iraq. The U.S. has held Georgia up as a beacon of democracy in the former Soviet Union. It was supposed to be an example to other former Soviet republics of the benefits of tilting to the West. How does this recent conflict impact the U.S. efforts, other efforts in the region?
Well, one of the things you have to remember, and we try to remember in our business, is things take time. Patience is not an American virtue, but in the countries where we work, these efforts can take 5, 10, sometimes 15, 20. They may even take longer than that. And it is certainly the case that with Ukraine and Georgia as democratic examples in the former CIS, that other countries are looking and saying, why can't we do the same? But it doesn't happen overnight. These efforts, this struggle that people have for democracy is not an overnight thing, just as it was not an overnight thing in our own country.
Let's hear from Columbus, Michigan next on our Independence line. Good morning. Columbus, you're on the air. Go ahead. Romulus, Michigan, Democratic caller. Next.
Good morning, Mr. Craner and Mr. Wollack and our C-SPAN facilitator. I have a question and then a comment then a question for Mr. Wollack concerning his institute. My first question is my comment is really based on C-SPAN. I was hoping they're going to have some rebuttal to Mrs. Republican that was on this morning for 30 minutes trashing Senator Obama. But anyway, my question is for Mr. Wollack. I want to know how his institute connects to the current Democratic push to get Mr. Obama elected. Is there a liaison? Is there some kind of link between what you do, what you're sitting on TV talking about this morning, and actually getting your word out to help elect a Democratic president? Because, like I said, we could stand for a 30-minute rebuttal to Mrs. Republicans trashing this morning. Thank you.
Well, neither institute is involved in domestic politics in the United States. Based on our charter, the work that our institutes carry out is work overseas. This was established because of a bipartisan vision by the United States Congress. And although the Republican Institute has prominent Republicans on its boards, the Democratic Institute has prominent Democrats on its board, we are nonpartisan organizations. And therefore, the work that we carry out overseas is nonpartisan as well. But we are not engaged domestically in politics here.
And a look here at this is the summer 2008 National Democratic Institute. This is your summer report for the NDI and the International Republican Institute. Here is your annual report for 2006. You mentioned Madeleine Albright is your chairman. Senator John McCain is the chairman of of your institute as well. Now, is he an active chairman, or is that an honorary position?
No. He's been our chairman for about 15 years, and he's been a very active chairman. Obviously, lately he's been a little distracted from IRI and been doing other things. But we have board members. David Dreyer's on our board, Chuck Hagel, Brent Scowcroft, Larry Eagleberger, Rich Williamson, a host of people who have both diplomatic, foreign policy, and political backgrounds.
We've been talking a lot about Georgia and Russia this morning, but your summer report has an update on Kenya and the recent elections there. Can you give us a brief update?
Well, following what was a very, very flawed elections that took place last year, and based on international intervention led by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, they agreed on a power-sharing agreement between President Kibaki and what was to become a new constitutional order that would have a prime ministership led by Raila Odinga. That coalition has been established. It has stayed together. It is functioning, but it is still a fragile situation in Kenya that requires, I believe, the international community to stay actively engaged, as both of our institutes are, working with the government, working with political parties, sharing experiences on coalition building and on coalition governments from other countries around the world. And as Lorne had said earlier, it's not about promoting an American style of democracy. Rather, it's sharing international experiences, both the strengths and weaknesses of certain democratic processes and practices.
And Lorne Kramer, the Republican Institute, in your report, your annual report, I'll look at Africa, writing about Zimbabwe, an increasingly repressive political environment. IRI provides training to pro-democracy political parties and civil society organizations on communications, message development, and activity planning. The latest news from Zimbabwe is that there is some sort of reconciliation possibly going between Morgan Tsvangirai, the opposition, and President Mugabe. What has your institute heard so far?
Well, they're in negotiations to try and bring about some kind of agreement. I mean, this is a good example of why we do what we do. In 1980, when apartheid ended, the white regime ended in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe was a hero. 15, 20 years later, he'd been in power for a long time. And without a democratic mechanism to find a new ruler, one that was allowed to function, essentially the country has gone to rot. I mean, I think you have 10,000, 100,000% inflation going on in Zimbabwe right now. If you had in a country like Zimbabwe a mechanism for the people to be able to say to a ruler like Mr. Mugabe, thank you for all you've done, but we want to look forward. We want to elect a new leader. You would not have had these problems in Zimbabwe.
Did either of your organizations have observers in the Zimbabwean elections?
Not in the most recent.
No, they would not. They would choose which observers that they wanted to come to the country. Although we worked with local groups on the ground, civic organizations, to assist their efforts to monitor the process.
Let's go to Hudson, Florida, a Republican caller. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. I have a question for you. With the American people thinking that our senators and congressmen, we just basically have a 9% approval rating right now, what is your view on if the time is right for the people of America to be able to ask for term limits?
A little off topic, but to take that a little farther, that in terms of in an election season, in political season, where you often hear about U.S. spending abroad, how difficult is it for either of your organizations to get your message out about promoting democracy worldwide, first of all? And secondly, when you hear the term nation building, what do you think?
Well, one of the things Ken and I do together is speak across the U.S. at the World Affairs Councils in different cities. And what we have found when we walk in the room is people look at us and say, democracy building, Iraq, Afghanistan, we're not interested. And if we were able to explain how we do what we do, that we understand, like I said, in all of these countries it's going to take time, that it's their struggle, not our struggle, that we have to walk behind them, and they have to lead. And if we take that attitude and people understand that's how we work, that we're not running in and saying we're Americans and we're here to tell you how it's done, then people come to appreciate more what we're doing, how we're doing what we're doing, and frankly, how little it costs.
When you hear that term, nation building, what do you think?
Well, nation building usually comes to mind the notion of working in a society in a post-conflict environment, where society has been decimated by war, by civil conflict, and the need for the international community to come in a major way to provide economic and political support to basically to provide the fundamental infrastructure of a new society. And in certain countries, this isn't badly needed, and the international community has to organize itself in a way that provides the needed resources and expertise to assist citizens in those societies emerging from conflict.
Collins, Mississippi is next, an independent caller.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to ask you a question. First, I want to make a brief statement. I believe that Mr. McCain is what the people want. I believe that Barack Obama is what this country needs. And also, because the reason I say that is because when Barack Obama went abroad and John McCain had kept urging him, he even had a clock that he put up there and put the hours up, that Barack Obama needs to go over into Iraq. He needs to visit these places and see what's going on. So when he went the way that he wanted to go, and he went to the place that he wanted to go. And when he went there, the people began to feel good about America in every aspect of it. They began to look at him not as in so much as presidential as the media portrayed, but they looked at someone that had an open ear. They looked at someone that they could say is fresh, and even though he does not have quote unquote experience. But this president administration had all kind of experience overseas and with the foreign people over there, and they mocked it. They mocked him. And then when he went over there, now the media put on there as Barack Obama being arrogant, being presidential. You know, it's sad to see this kind of democracy, I said that word right, about international relationships. And that's one of the major political moves that we can have, and this election is the international relationship. So I'm asking you guys, do you really believe that America that criticizes a person that people respect over there, not burning flags, not hanging people up, do you really think that America has begun to be a media thing now and tearing down someone because people over there respect you more?
Caller, and let our guest respond. Thank you.
Well, I think in this campaign here, international relations will be an important aspect. I think there is no doubt, if you look at opinion polls around the world, American popularity is not very high. I think the controversy over the Iraq War is one of the major reasons. So certainly public diplomacy, America reaching out to the rest of the world, working in a multilateral way, working with friends and partners around the world, listening better. This is something I think that the international community is seeking. Both candidates, I believe, in terms of the work that we do, are internationalists and believe strongly in the notion that America has to stand for its interests and its values around the world. And I think that will do a great deal in promoting America's role and standing around the world.
Our guest, Ken Wollack with the National Democratic Institute, and Lorne Kramer with the International Republican Institute for another half hour or so, talking about their report on promoting democracy around the world. A little historical context in this report about making democracy central to U.S. policy. The report writes, while support for democracy in U.S. foreign policy can be traced to the country's earliest days in the modern era, we often cite Woodrow Wilson's vision of foreign policy grounded in principles of promoting just government based on the consent of the governed. Just a little bit, from the Atlantic Charter to the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, and the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, promoting democratic development has a long tradition in U.S. policy. How has promotion of democracy changed since Woodrow Wilson's time?
Well, I think if you go, as the report says, back to the very earliest days, you talk about John Winthrop, you talk about the city on the hill, it was certainly one of the things that the founders, those who came here in the 1600s, hoped would happen, that others would look to America as an example of religious tolerance, of more freedom. I think Woodrow Wilson hoped to bring freedom through the diplomatic process to other countries. I think all through that period, up until the 1970s, a lot of Americans hoped that we would be an example to other countries. I think what Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan said was, let's not just passively sit back and watch. If people are interested in hearing from us, if they're interested in hearing about how we built our freedom here in America, let's offer that. And you've seen all the way through the Carter, the Reagan, the Bush, the Clinton, the Bush administration, and now I think, as Ken said, whoever comes next, this kind of bipartisan, long-standing desire to be able to assist others as they build their democracy. I think the big difference you've seen, as I said, in the past few years, the big difference that I notice is how many more countries are interested in doing this. Australia, Spain, the Dutch, countries in Central Europe. We bring trainers now from South Africa, from South Korea, from Indonesia, to talk about how their countries built their democracy and their freedoms, because the American example is not always exactly applicable to every country overseas.
I would agree with that. I think there are two things. I think, first of all, the growing interdependence around the world, the interconnectedness that exists around the world. This is a much smaller world, and what happens for good or for evil not only affects citizens of one country, but it affects us all. And so, in a sense, we have a responsibility for each other. I think the second issue, as Lorne said, others are engaged in this, and it's not only other countries are engaged in this work, too. If you look at intergovernmental organizations, if you look at the United Nations, about close to 1/2 of the funds spent by the United Nations Development Program, it's for democracy and governance. If you look at the international financial institutions, that they are now concluding that human development economic development and political openness are linked.
About what percentage of the U.S. Of the UN budget is funded by the U.S.?
I believe around 20% right now.
Something like that.
Let's hear from Detroit next. A Democratic caller. Good morning.
Okay, good morning, gentlemen. May I request both the gentlemen to be not so grim and put a smile on their faces so that the callers can feel a little more
it's early in the
at
morning.
ease.
They're not grim.
I have been seeing for the start of the program. That's what my conclusion is. Anyway,
We haven't had enough coffee yet.
yeah, gentlemen, you have expressed some kind of some self-criticism about our democracy and trying to promote that in the rest of the world. But are you willing to take little more criticism today to understand how the rest of the 6 billion free and civilized humanity look at what we preach and what we do? I tell you, there is a 21st century new free world order that is emerging. It is different from the white colonial masters' world order of the last 500 years. That is one thing I want you to remember. And being self-righteous, self-absorbed, and groupthink is not going to help American democracy in promoting the values of American values outside the United States. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Constitution that was written 200 plus years ago by white colonial masters, slave masters actually, has no relevance in 21st century. We have to think about it, even to the extent of rewriting the Constitution, that which is obsolete, old, and irrelevant to 21st century. The second thing is, when we want to promote democracies, we cannot have countries like, create countries like Qatar, Kuwait, Brunei, countries that were established only for the sake of the self-interest of the United States or the Western countries. So I want to make these 2 points to you, and I want to listen to you, your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I would only make a couple points. First of all, we are not promoting American values. We have, over the past 25 years, worked in more than 100 countries around the world. And what we have found, I believe, not surprisingly, is a common humanity, that people in all countries around the world, people in all regions around the world, want basically the same thing. They want to be able to put food on their table, and they want to have a say in the political issues that affect their lives. And so therefore the work that we do deals with those universal aspirations and desires. And the polling that I have seen all over the world shows that there is no clash of civilizations, that people ultimately want the same things and aspire to some form of free expression. And I think what we do in the work that we do is join with others. Again, this is not an American enterprise. We join with others to share experiences, to share ideas, and to share expertise around the world at countries going through a transition, that to build institutions that reflect the hopes, the aspirations, and the will of their own people.
I found his comments about the Constitution very interesting. This is the oldest Constitution in the world that we have here. Many other countries, if you actually look at the wording of their Constitution, have modeled it on what the U.S. has done. And the reason is because it's been so durable. It's been amended many times. But at the end of the day, what the Constitution did here was set up a series of institutions, courts, a legislature, and an executive branch, that ultimately, if one of them was out of whack, that the system, those 3 branches, could right what had gone wrong. There's been a lot of criticism over the last few years about U.S. detainee policy, but you cannot open a newspaper or turn on a TV news show without hearing about a new court case or a new legislative action regarding detainees. A lot of people said the pendulum had swung too far one way on detainees. Those other institutions were able to bring it back. That's what this Constitution is all about, and it served America quite well.
Republican caller next, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. what's so great about democracy? I mean, I'm an American. I'm here in this country, like countless Americans, and we watch our government pass bills, give money to Africa, like $50 billion they just gave to Africa. And that was a baby of the pharmaceutical lobby. And the lobbies are running our country. I mean, this caller before wants to talk about a Barack Obama. Barack Obama's running for president, not emperor. Barack Obama's going to do this or he's going to do that. Now you have democracies all over the country. I mean, you have democracies in Canada, you have democracies in England. They're still faced with this lobbyist problem, and we want to ram that down the throat. Well, I won't say we want to ram it down the throat. This situation that's going on in Georgia, where the president has called for a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire. Now, let's roll back to 2006, when the Jews went over into Lebanon, bombed Beirut, leveled their city, killed all these people in 2006, and our president stood with his hands in his pockets, not one word out of the State Department, condemning that action. That's because the Jewish lobby is the strongest lobby in Washington, and they're also in England, and they're in 5 or 6 different democracies are basically in charge.
Pennsylvania, I'm going to give our guests a chance to respond. Do you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I would say what's so great about living in a democracy, that you have the opportunity to change what what in your mind you just described as the issues. In other countries, you would just have to sit back and watch. But here you have the opportunity to get involved politically, to work for people that you think will want to change that system. But that's up to you. You have to do it. In a democracy, the government has responsibilities, but in a democracy, the citizens also have responsibilities.
Lorne Kramer, your group writes about China. We'll turn this topical for a moment with the Olympics. In your annual report of 2006, the IRI supporting the participation of Chinese citizens and independent institutions in civic and political life. I'll start with you, Ken. With the Olympics going on, the Chinese displaying the success of their system, I guess for lack of a better term, a communist capitalist system. Does this present challenges to groups like yours who want to promote a democracy around there? Are they showing that their model is successful in China?
Well, I think ultimately their model is going to lead to growing demand for political rights in their country. We're beginning to see this already at the local level, and it will eventually reach the national level. When you open up economically, ultimately there will be a demand to not only choose in the marketplace of goods, but choose in the marketplace of ideas as well. So if one doesn't look at this as a snapshot, but look at this as a trend, this will eventually lead to more political openness in the country, because ultimately what people are demanding throughout the country. And this is a country that's also going through some very difficult times economically, too, and that has come out during the reports from the Olympics.
Lorne Kramer, has the president been outspoken enough in terms of human rights and individual freedoms in China?
Yeah, I think he has. I noted the meeting that he had before he left, the speech he gave in Bangkok. He's been very frank about it while he's been in China. I saw an interview with him last night on NBC in the middle of these sporting events where he was talking about these issues again. But I think what he recognizes is that because of the economic changes that have occurred within China, political allowances have been necessary. Local elections in China at the village level, more authority for legislatures, slightly more freedom in the press, though you still can cross a lot of lines in China. But what has happened over the last 15 or 20 years is, as they have decided to open up the economic system, it has necessitated beginning to open up the political system. And my guess is that what will happen in China is that change will come from the rural areas, the people who feel disadvantaged by this change, the people you're not going to see in all the reports about the glittering skyscrapers in Shanghai and Beijing. But that's the real China. That's 800-900 million Chinese.
Let's hear from Milford, Pennsylvania next, an independent caller. Welcome.
Hi, I'm a college student. I'm a little bit nervous, but I just wanted to define democracy on my terms is democracy is participation in power.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely correct. I think that's the finest definition. You can, give all sorts of caveats about this or that system or how many branches of government you have to have or whatever. But at the end of the day, as Ken said, people want to say in their future. in their economic and their political future. If you live in a dictatorship, you have no say. If you live in a democracy, you certainly have complaints. We all have complaints about the United States, but we're all free to try and fix them here. In a lot of other countries, they're not, and they would like to have that freedom.
You know, ultimately, as John F. Kennedy said, democracy is not about a final achievement. It's a call to an untiring effort. That democratic systems do not necessarily go, as the former Polish foreign minister said, Bronislaw Geremek, from one triumph to another. It requires diligence. It requires very, very hard work on the part of citizens, on the part of political leaders, and the need to correct deficiencies in the system. We have learned that in our own political system here over 200 years, and other countries are going through that process as well. It doesn't guarantee that you do not make mistakes, but it's the best system for correcting mistakes. And it is not only, I would say, the participation which is important, but creating institutions and processes that allow that participation to take place in a way that it enjoys the confidence of the citizens of the country.
Next to Allentown, Pennsylvania, a Democratic caller.
Yes, well, I was going to ask a question about the current situation with Georgia and Russia, and if you thought they were emboldened by our situation in Iraq. But I also want to make one statement about the two calls previous from Wolfsburg. You know, I feel that what's so great about democracy, I mean, we have the ability to change things. I mean, if you look at the last 8 years, I feel a lot of things have gone wrong, and there was a lot of abuses of power, and, you know, speaking of an emperor, you know, executive privilege and whatnot. But, you know, we have the ability now to change it, and I think it's every person's responsibility in democracy to learn what each candidate's about and then exercise your right to vote.
Lorne Kramer.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, as I said before, that's the beauty of democracy. If you don't like your leaders, if you think somebody else can do better, here you can do something about it. You can change them. Many of the countries where we work, places like Zimbabwe, Belarus, Cuba, Burma, the people have no such access to new leaders, and the leaders that they have, the dictators that they have, can just drive their country into the ground.
What about areas like the Palestinian territories where the Hamas was elected democratically in an election there, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, but the Bush administration has not recognized those two parties?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about this topic. Some people say, well, the Palestinians elected Hamas, so we should deal with them. Democracy doesn't always produce governments we love. Democracy, the German people made a mistake, it produced a Hitler. In recent times, democracy has produced governments in Europe, for example, France or Germany, with whom we didn't get along all the time. Because a country has a democracy, I don't think that should mean that we should embrace whatever government and their policies that those people produce. I think what has happened in Palestine actually was not enough democracy, not enough elections fast enough to tell Fatah how they were governing badly. And had elections occurred in the 1990s as they were supposed to have occurred, and the early part of this decade, Fatah would have gotten some wake-up calls about how poorly they were running the place, and Hamas never would have come about.
We should also remember, even in the European context, when Mr. Haidar was elected as president of Austria, the Europeans immediately slapped sanctions on Austria because it did not believe that President Haidar represented the values of Europe, the principles, the democratic principles of Europe. So the notion of just having an election is not sufficient for democracy. In terms of Palestine, I think one of the great weaknesses of the elections that took place was that Hamas was not required to pay an entrance price for entering the political arena. There were no candidate requirements, so Hamas could advocate violence and run for political power simultaneously. And that is a statement that we issued at the time, undermined a fundamental principle of a democratic election, which is ultimately a peaceful means to achieve your political end.
Let's go to Birmingham, Michigan on our Republican line. For Ken Wollack and Lorne Kramer, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Wollack and Kramer. I think both of you would best put your talents toward repairing the democracy that we are so lacking in our country. Just because we have an election does not necessarily mean that our democracy is flourishing in this country. I just would like to make a couple of comments in observing the news this week. Actually, the first comment was Amnesty International had a speech about the president. Now, he spoke about democracy and things that China should do. However, he never said those words to the Chinese. It was either Taiwan or I think it was in Taiwan that he delivered the speech. Of course, the Chinese blocked that off, and so those people don't hear. Also, another thing that I found quite interesting is the president's saying that a disappropriate military offense was taken by the Russians in regards to what happened in Ossetia. Now, shock and awe was certainly a huge amount of ordnance that was used. As an American, I feel that some of our people speak out of both sides of their mouth. And as far as Hamas, the election was wrong because the wrong people got in, not the ones that we wanted, not because they didn't follow the right thing or this. When people vote, you should respect that vote.
Thanks, Michigan.
Let me just take up the China point because I do know a little bit about this, having been in the administration. The president has repeatedly, with Chinese leaders, in every meeting he has with Chinese leaders, brought up the topics of human rights, democracy, religious freedom. He did so again in the meetings that he just had. I was honored to be able to sit in on some of those meetings when I was at the State Department and saw him at length address these topics. I also recall a speech that he gave at one of Beijing's largest universities, Tsinghua University, specifically about this topic that was broadcast unedited out to the people in China. So it is certainly the case that he talks about these issues here in Washington. He talked about them, as you noted, in Thailand. But he has also been very direct and he's very frank with other leaders on these issues. And I've been able to see him do that a number of times.
In your report, you write about defining democracy, and part of it reads, democracy is legitimate governmental authority that derives from a body of citizens regardless of gender, race, religion, national, ethnic, or social origin, or political or other opinion. What they have in common are the basic concepts of democratic governance. These include the ability to participate directly in government and public affairs and to choose, through genuine elections, representatives to occupy office and exercise powers of government. They also include the ability to benefit from structures of accountability, including the legislature, Parliament and the rule of law, and the ability to exercise freedom of association and expression and otherwise enjoy respect for human rights and equality of treatment. How much of your work goes into supporting not just the election part of it, but in terms of the legislature, the judiciary, the executive, the sort of triangle of democracy?
Well, probably if you analyzed our budget, you would find that less than 20% of our budgets go toward elections. Most of the work that we do are between elections, and also to help democracies deliver, to help political institutions in these societies respond to citizens in a way that all citizens can benefit and not just a privileged few. Because if these intermediary organizations that you refer to, political parties and parliaments, fail to fulfill their special role in society and citizens become disillusioned, one of two things usually happens. As Joseph Stiglitz once wrote, a former World Bank official, people go to the streets, and that is not the place where public policy issues should be resolved. Or they may vote for a populist demagogue who will promise a people's democracy and cut out those representative institutions in society. So making those institutions work and function and be accountable and responsible to citizens' concerns is a major part of the work that we do. And sharing experiences from around the world of how those institutions can be built and sustained is a major part of the work.
Quincy, Pennsylvania next. Independent caller.
Thank you for taking my call.
Good to have you with us.
The gentleman mentioned that sometimes they bring other people from other countries in to see our elective process, and I would hasten to tell them that they should take some of the people into Florida and show them how they stole an election?
The OSCE, a number of delegates were invited to Florida. They did see the election there, and they will be invited again next time.
Again, our guests this morning for the next 5 minutes or so, Lorne Kramer and Ken Wollack, the new report on promoting democracy. I want to give our viewers a look at some of the recommendations your report calls for. It calls for re-energizing the alliances among democratically minded nations, committing the resources to fix the UN's Human Rights Council, ensuring continued funding and participation in regional organizations, make democracy promotion a key pillar of U.S. foreign policy. It will continue support of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, support democracy programs in Iraq, and ensure that efforts are understood by American diplomats. Back to the UN Human Rights Council. What's the problem there?
Well, there are structural problems in the way that the Council has organized itself, that it focuses on basically one or two issues around the world, and that focuses on Israel, and generally ignores all the other large-scale human rights abuses that take place around the world. So it has to be organized in a way that provides membership to countries that are not dominated by human rights abusers, and provides a place for those countries that are human rights protectors, a way to at least have influence in the deliberations of the Council.
Why hasn't the UN been able to do that yet? Not enough members support that, or?
Well, it's a process, as we talked about before. This is an ongoing process. There were reforms that took place, but the reforms did not correct the serious problems that remain within the Council.
Chicago is next. A Democrat. How you doing?
Fine, thank you.
You're on the air.
I wanted to know what the position is of the of your panel on the Milton Friedman shock treatment theory that has been dispersed around the world. South America, they wipe out governments, hollowing them out by privatizing the infrastructure like prisons, roads, Social Security. And what happens after that is a middle class is wiped out, and it creates a super rich or super poor society. Now, Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld have all been quoted as liking this particular thing, and they do this under the interest of democracy. Even the oil crisis right now, they're pushing the drill because that's oil is a crisis. So therefore, let's drill when they don't have to drill. They overran Chile 9/11/73. They went to war in Iraq 9/11/2001. What are your positions on this? Is this what you're dispensing around the country? They call them around the world, the Chicago Boys theory.
Either of you have a response? Or?
Well, first of all, we do not advocate particular economic policies or political policies. That ultimately we believe that these are issues that have to be resolved by democratically elected governments. What we try to do in these situations is bring different experiences, but ultimately it's the citizens of these countries and those that fail to deliver, as I mentioned earlier, for all citizens and not just for the privileged few, are destined to fail, and their institutions are destined to fail. So there is an interest in these countries. You mentioned Latin America. One of the major failures in Venezuela was the failure of the political institutions that preceded Hugo Chavez. Chavez once said that he's not the cause, he's the result. He's the result of failed political institutions. And so ultimately, unless these political institutions reform themselves and respond to marginalized communities and the poor, then we're going to see future upheavals in these societies. So I do believe that the political institutions have to respond to the needs of all citizens. How they achieve those, what policies they adopt, ultimately is left to them. These are not issues that we have to impose or in our work.
Let's get one more caller here. Camden, South Carolina, a Republican. Welcome.
Good morning. China and Russia are tired of George Bush bullying the world. And like your first guest said, millions of Iraqis have been displaced and dead.
Our last caller there talking about China and Russia, we kind of began talking about Georgia and Russia, but we didn't talk much about South America, and Ken Wollack just mentioned Hugo Chavez. What are your report's concerns over that area of the world?
Well, this is the area where in the 1980s this democratic wave that we've seen over the last 25, 30 years really began. In political terms, in electoral terms. But as Ken said, most of our work now is what occurs between elections. And I think that's the issue in Latin America, is people do not feel well governed in terms of their material advancement. There's an equation of democracy with prosperity. They've looked at the U.S., we're prosperous, we're democratic, and that's what they expect when they become a democracy. The issue in Latin America is the institutions to support that advancement, the court systems, the end of corruption, tougher legislatures in dealing with their presidents. And those are the issues where the many Latin American countries, not all, Chile runs very well, a number of countries run very well, but many Latin American countries need to be buttressed. And then they will be able, I think, to provide appropriate economic opportunities to their citizens.
Lorne Kramer, president of the International Republican Institute, and Ken Wollack, who is president of the National Democratic Institute. The report is New Directions for Democracy Promotion. If folks, viewers, and listeners want to read this online, is there a place they can go?
To the respective websites of the Institute.
And your website is?
www.ndi.org.
And?
www.iri.org.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
We are joined next by Connie Doubley, with a C-SPAN producer, who in 2005, she was joined by fellow producers to put together a series on returning Iraq War veterans. Conversations with Iraq War Veterans is the name of the program. We revisit 4 of those veterans this week. Connie Doubley, thank you for joining us this morning. What will we see this week?
What you're going to see is a side-by-side look at some of the issues that faced these 4 veterans 3 years ago when they were recuperating from